So the main reason that I'm doing this, obviously, is practice. I'm trying to learn a new skill, which I'm assuming is probably true for most of the people that are watching this. Um, One of the things that I noticed whenever I was going through a lot of the information that's out here on YouTube is that there aren't a lot of practical exercises. People talk about like how to get started with dictation, what tools to use, do's and don'ts, that kind of thing. But they don't talk about how they're actually approaching the process, which I thought was really kind of weird, or give you like a, hey, here's how to get started, other than, don't look at your page, general kind of advice sort of stuff, right? So I wanted to do something that was a little bit more in depth and kind of talk about how I would approach it, or how I'm choosing to approach it, I guess is probably a better way to put it, right? Um, so what I'm going to do is kind of like a dry run, showing what I'm doing, um, and how it's working out, like what the process actually looks like, what I get whenever I'm done, what the actual result is as I'm doing this, right? So the tools that I'm going to be using is Dragon, but if you don't want to pay for Dragon, which I understand because it's like 500 bucks, I think I got it a couple of years ago on sale during like Black Friday for like half that. Um, and I'm using Dragon Pro specifically, um, and I'll explain why later on. But another good tool to use is Otter AI. I think you get like 600 minutes of audio free a month or something like that. So that's a good alternative if you don't want to spend a bunch of money. I'm using Windows specifically. I'm sure that there's alternatives for OS X, but I don't use OS X, so I can't really speak to them. Um, and I don't have any crazy mic setup or anything like that, right? I'm just using a regular gaming headset, Corsair Void Elite, I think. Um, and so a lot of people say like use a Yeti, and that's great. And I have a Yeti, right? But I'm not going to want to necessarily sit in place the whole time that I'm dictating. It's a lot easier for me just to have something on my head that I can talk into as I'm doing this, right? That way I can kind of walk around. And I like keeping my hands free, and I don't like being stuck in one place. I'm a pretty fidgety person, so yeah. So any mic works. I mean, I think what you're really looking for, in my opinion, and I haven't had any problems with just a regular gaming headset, right, is something that has noise cancellation and something that captures your audio pretty well, right? And I'm doing this a little bit differently than some people, and I'll get into that whenever I start talking about process and stuff. And yeah, I'm also using Windows Audio Recorder, and the reason I'm using Windows Audio Recorder is because, and so this gets into the point that I was just trying to make, right? Um, when you're doing dictation and you're actually dictating live, right? You see the words going across the page, and it really messes with your train of thought. Um, you'll start noticing like imperfections, or that it's not doing the spelling correctly, or that you miss some punctuation or something like that, and it really kind of takes you out of the zone when you're trying to think about what to say, um, which is less than desirable. Cool. So without further ado, I'll kind of walk through the whole process and we'll go ahead and get started, right? So the very first thing I do is what I'm doing right now. I'm just opening up Microsoft Voice Recorder, or anything that really records your audio. Audacity would work. I'm sure that anything that basically spits out an MP3 at the time that you're done is usable, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and hit record. One other point I want to make before I go ahead and get started, right, is if you notice in the background, I'm running Scrivener. This could easily be a Word doc or pretty much anything else, right? But I'm using Scrivener because that's what I use. Um, and basically, before I did all this, all I really did was draft out a bunch of talking points, right? So if you've ever done any sort of public speaking where you're putting notes down on note cards, or you've had to talk to a PowerPoint or something like that, That's basically what I did here. I think I probably spent maybe an hour coming up with my points, right? Like what I wanted to talk about. And basically, as I'm doing this talk, what I'm really just doing is I'm just looking at those bullet points to figure out where I left off and what I want to talk about next, that kind of thing, right? Which is why you see this nice little document in front of me. Okay, so the very first thing that I want to talk about is the difference between dictation and typing by hand, right? So if you're like me, the way that I do it is I would type something out as I'm like working on a novel or something like that, and type a little bit, think a little bit, type a little bit more, think a little bit more, right? And as I'm doing that, what I'm doing is I'm being really selective with the words that I'm using. Um, Whereas whenever you're dictating, you're speaking naturally, like I'm doing right now. You don't really have time to think about those words, right? So what I'm really kind of doing is kind of like a seat of the pants sort of stream of consciousness. I'm basically removing the filter in my brain and just spitting out whatever's coming out as I'm thinking it, right? I'm not putting a whole lot of thought and choosing my words to pick the very best words. And you'll notice that I, use pauses and I say and all the things that you really aren't supposed to do whenever you're publicly speaking or if you were rehearsing a speech. But like I said, this is kind of informal and I'm just kind of throwing something together, so it is what it is, right? So when you think about it like that, right, and you're talking normally like I'm doing right now, you don't really have the option of, thinking about your words and kind of doing those pauses that you would naturally do um, whenever you're writing it down by hand or, typing, right? And so that gets into this whole concept of like a rough draft versus a first draft, right? So I always thought that what I was doing whenever I was typing previously, right, was creating a rough draft. The very first draft is your rough draft. But I think that whenever you're actually thinking selectively about how you want to word things, it's actually more of a first draft, right? You're putting a lot of thought and effort into basically crafting how those words go together very carefully, right? And so it's not the very first thing that pops into your mind, as opposed to a rough draft, which is what I'm trying to get out of dictating. I'm basically just trying to get all of my thoughts out and get them on paper, right? It's not going to be a pretty thing at the end. It's going to be pretty ugly. Um, it's definitely not going to be perfect. And whenever we look at this here in a minute, you're going to see that there's probably a lot of work that needs to go into it, right? But the whole purpose of it is to just kind of get my thoughts onto the page, right? And what I'm looking for there is just a supporting structure that gets down all of the basic points of what I'm trying to do, um, that I have something to work with later, right? You're probably going to end up saying a lot more than you're going to end up using. You'll say things or repeat yourself, or you'll decide to entirely scrap entire paragraphs of stuff that's coming out of your mouth, right? Because it's not important to the finished document, right? So expect that you're going to end up getting way more than you use. Expect that it's going to probably look like trash whenever you first look at it. It's entirely expected whenever you're doing it this way, right? Um, Another good point is allow yourself to go off on tangents, right? If you're thinking about something, um, how do I want to put this? If something crops up in your mind during the process of dictating, it's good to leave that in. It may not be something that you use, but capturing those thoughts is kind of like putting notes in line as you're talking, right? It gives you something to explore or think about later on after you're done dictating, right? So it might not be useful in the context of like the chapter that you're working on or a finished result, but it might be something that you can just kind of pull out and put somewhere else, like, oh, that was an interesting thought. Maybe I'll look at that, right? And it gives you something to work with later on, right? And so that's what I mean whenever I say inline notes right there, right? Um, And so the very first exercise is essentially what I'm doing right now, right? I call it stream of consciousness, and it is literally just me removing the filter on my brain and just spitting out the words as they come to me, like I'm doing right now, right? That's what it is. Um, what would I say that the actual use of this technique would be useful for, or this exercise? Uh, what I'm doing right now, which is getting used to talking, getting used to dictating words to kind of use later on, right? The process of actually speaking into the mic, recording something, and getting used to like how I'm going to edit it, clean it up, what it looks like at the end, that sort of thing. So that will get you over the hump, so to speak. Collecting your thoughts. This would be really good for something like outlining, right? Where I'm not entirely sure what direction my story is going to go in, um, but I know that there's something that I want to do, right? So I'm basically just throwing out all of my thoughts so that I can look at them later and be like, okay, that's a good idea, that's not a good idea, and kind of selectively choosing the stuff that I want, right? It's also probably pretty good for taking notes, um, because I can speak way more quickly than I'm going to get words out on the page. It's really frustrating to be thinking about something and then start typing and then realize that you forgot what you were thinking about 2 seconds before. Um, it just basically losing your train of thought because you're focusing on one thing, and this kind of prevents that, right? So let's talk about the process of doing this, right? Which I am doing as we speak. Um, so pick a topic. So right now I'm doing this talk on how to dictate and like a good exercise to get used to it, right? But it doesn't have to be that, right? So you don't have to do a talk on the same thing, right? And obviously you probably wouldn't. But it could be anything. I could pick a topic and say, okay, I want to talk about how my day went today, right? And I could just list down a bunch of bullet points and talk about all the things that happened in my day. Um, I could talk about a memory from my past and everything that I remember about that. I could talk about my plans for the future. I could talk about what I think about a person or a character, right? It could be anything. So just pick a topic so that you have kind of like a bounding box to kind of keep your thoughts kind of in, right? Because otherwise it'll go way off the rails and you won't even know where you're going with it, right? The second thought is gathering those thoughts, which is what this outline right here, or I guess these talking points, it's really less of an outline, more of talking points, is all about, right? And you can structure this any way that you want to. In my case, like I said, I structured it as a bunch of bullet points. This could easily be a PowerPoint. This really works well for me. You'll just have to play with it to figure out what works well for you. If you don't have an idea and you just want to explore something, I recommend bullet points. Um, the next thing is to actually hit the record button, right? So, and just literally anything that comes to the mind, just say it out loud. You know, some of it might be silly, some of it might be half formed. And you aren't really, like I said, don't selectively think about how you want to word something, right? It's not as important as actually just getting the information out. So I'm talking like I would normally talk. Um, I'm not thinking about how I want to say something. I'm not thinking about the way I want to structure something. I'm literally just, as a thought comes to me, I'm spitting it out, right? So go with the word vomit. Follow your thoughts. Another thing that you'll realize is that a lot of people that do dictation, they actually do, you know, inline punctuation, right? I don't do that at all. And that's because I transcribe it at the end. Um, and Dragon's actually gotten really good at this over the years. They've added some machine learning stuff, which has allowed them to kind of forgo that. It's smart enough to guess 90% of the time, and I also don't mind going back and adding in my punctuation at the end. So I just ignore it. So in terms of punctuation, if I was going to be using punctuation while I was speaking this, which isn't a bad idea, um, probably the best thing to do would be only use one thing. The only thing that I would use is new paragraph, which probably just put a new paragraph in here. And the reason for that is it's a way of, not getting a big blob of text at the end, which is probably what I'm going to end up with. Like whenever I'm, outlining, that's usually what I do is thought, then new paragraph, then next thought, new paragraph, and so on and so forth, right? And that's just to break it up so that I don't have this big block that I have to figure out where I ended one thought and started the next. Um, but if you want to do inline punctuation, by all means, go ahead and do inline punctuation. Um, but it can really mess with your train of thought when you're doing that because you're focusing on where to put punctuation instead of actually just saying the stuff. So your call, right? The next thing that I would do is transcribe, which you'll see here in a second. Then I'm going to end up with a bunch of junk. Like I said, this is probably going to end up as a giant blob of text at the end of this, right? So the next thing I need to do is clean up what the result of that is and get it looking like actual words. Then after that, what I'm going to go ahead and do is once I get it cleaned up, and by clean up, all I'm talking about is adding that basic punctuation, making sure that the structure looks correct, right? I'm not actually thinking about what the text needs to say so much as I am, does this look grammatically correct? Does the structure look okay, right? The next phase is going to be editing, and that's where I'm going through and I'm reading what the output is, and I'm trying to determine how to make it look better. That's where I'm starting to look at what I have and trying to rethink the words that I put in, right? After that's done, it's the same process all over again. Pick another topic, then go through this whole process all over again, right? Until you have an end result, right? The last thing I want to talk about is pausing, right? So pausing while you're recording, and by that I mean like just stopping saying words, like I did right there, perfectly okay. What you probably don't want to do is physically pause it, right? So if I pull this up, I have a pause button right here, and I can pause that. Now that's useful if you're gathering your thoughts, right? But if you get used to doing that too often, you're going to get stuck in the same trap and you aren't going to get out as much words, or you aren't going to get as much written if you say something, then pause, then say something, then pause, then say something, then pause, as you would if you just kept going, right? So don't pause to correct yourself. Don't pause to repeat something. Don't pause to change something. Just literally say it as you go. So let's say I didn't like saying the words that I just said. I didn't like saying the words that I used, right? I just correct myself in line and keep going. Just barrel through it, right? And like I said, pausing every now and then to collect your thoughts, especially if you're moving on to something that you haven't quite worked out, isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just I wouldn't rely on it too much because it's going to slow you down, right? The only other point that I wanted to make while I'm doing this recording is to keep your recordings, right? At the end of this, I'm going to have a recording, and it's good to keep that for a couple of reasons. First off, when you're reading text, sometimes it's not immediately visible what the transcription missed. So it may have incorrectly put a word, and if I've been talking for a while like I am right now, like 15 minutes, I'm not going to know what that word was that I said 15 minutes ago, especially if I'm just kind of blurting it out like I'm doing right now, right? So having that to go back and like listen to what I actually meant is really useful. The other thing is that when you're reading through text, especially a big block of text, sometimes you won't notice that something sounds weird until you listen to it. So listening to an actual audio recording is useful in the sense that you can see how natural something sounds, right? Or if it feels right, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? Um, but yeah, that's more or less the gist of this. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. And now it's going to go ahead and save my recording, right? So the next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is Dragon Pro specifically. If you get Dragon Home, it's not going to have this, right? But Dragon Pro specifically has the ability to transcribe. It's underneath tools here. So if you notice, there's a transcribe recording here. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to point it at the audio file that I made, this one right here, and hit transcribe. It's going to tell me that one already exists because I've done this before. Now, going back to what I was saying earlier, right? Whereas if I was, using Dragon the way that most people do, right? Where I was allowing it to type across the screen as I talked, um, I probably would have noticed all the word choices that it was using, and it would have probably thrown me off a few times, which is why you always hear the advice, turn away, don't look at what it's typing, that kind of stuff, right? Set it down, walk away, that kind of thing. And that works too if you want to do it that way. But I found that, especially since I'm usually sitting in front of my computer as I'm doing this, specifically in this case because I'm recording this, right? Um, I would probably be more inclined to look at my screen, which is why I'm doing it this way. It totally works doing it the other way, right? Or if you want to throw it onto another screen and just focus on screen one, that works. Um, but yeah, like I said before, if you don't want to pay for Dragon, I've heard Otter AI is pretty good. And so the way that that would work, let's see if I got it up. I think I still do. Yeah. Is if you log into Otter.ai, right? There's this import button right here, and you would just upload the MP3 that came out of it. It'll take some time, and eventually it'll spit out a document with all your words on it, right? And that is an alternative. Like I said, I think you get 600 minutes free a month, which is a lot, actually, depending on how many drafts you end up doing, right? And like I said, I think that this is probably only useful for your rough draft. It's really to get the thoughts out of your head and onto the paper. I probably wouldn't be using dictation for like my cleanup phases. All of that's done by hand. Cleanup, editing, that kind of stuff. But it's a good way to get a bunch of stuff out really quickly. Now, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to go ahead and copy the transcribe stuff directly to the clipboard. I could open it up in Dragon Pad if I wanted to, or Word, or whatever else, but I just want to copy to the clipboard. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. Hit done. I'm going to go ahead and add a new document. I'll call this a transcribed example, right? Cool. And you notice that I have this big blob of stuff here, which is all of the stuff that I said. It came out to over 15 minutes. I spat out nearly 3,000 words, 2,500, give or take. Um, yeah. So the next bit is I'm going to go ahead and run through this and kind of start cleaning up the structure. I'm not going to do the whole thing because that'll take a long time. But if I get kind of quiet, that's because I'm reading this and it's hard to talk while I'm reading. So one thing I want to say here, right, is what I'm doing is I'm just looking for the natural break. So how I'm determining the structure is I'm looking for the natural break in thoughts, right? Um, where does one thought end and the next thought begin? Like, is this all the same kind of topic? Or have I switched, thought processes? Um, if so, then that's probably where this needs to break, right? Okay, that's probably good enough. I don't want to have you guys all sit here while I'm just, digging through this, right? That'd be kind of dumb. So, anyways, next thing I want to do, right, taking the sample, is I would start looking for grammar that's incorrect. So, change my punctuation. And I'm not going to do all of that, while I'm recording, right? Because you guys don't want to sit here and watch me edit. But I'd go back through here and I'd fix the punctuation, look for misspelled words like I did right here. You notice that I changed amen to ah. I think what I said is and it interpreted that as amen. It's not perfect. It's gonna mess up. That's why I said keep your recording, because then you can go back and take a look at what the recording's actually saying, right? But then, so basically, I have a structure. Let's pretend that I went through and I fixed the punctuation. The next thing I would go do through is I would do another pass where I looked at the actual words that I chose and think about if this is worded the way that I want it to be worded, right? Is this the best way that I could have said whatever it is that I was going to say? In this case, probably not. So I would start restructuring my actual word choice and start wordsmithing the sentences, right? Um, yeah, and that's about the gist of it, right? So this is one of a handful of exercises that I'm doing to kind of talk about dictation, right? Um, I will probably do other recordings on this in the future where I talk about, how to think about describing things, like so more prose-ish sort of things. Like I said, this particular exercise that we did right here, where I'm talking about just spitting out stream of consciousness, is really useful for getting down notes or like a rough outline or something like that. Or if you're talking to a point, doing something nonfiction maybe. But the other stuff that I want to focus on is specifically how would I do X, where X might be description or dialogue or whatever else, right? I haven't really thought it all the way through. Um, but yeah, that's kind of where I'll go from here. Let me know what you guys thought. Thanks.